For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu.
So in a globalized world where religion isn't going away, the study of theology, of understanding, when we think about that term as how people think about God, what people say about God, how that impacts what they actually do, is as important or more important than it ever has been. That is, at its most basic level, one of the reasons why what we do needs to continue to be done and why students should continue to think about studying it.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. You can't understand our globalized world without understanding religion. That's easier said than done. For any given person, it's sometimes hard enough to understand your own religious perspectives, let alone others, let alone the globe's. It's because our individual religious perspectives often change throughout life, modified by experience and ideas, modified by people and events, modified by an encounter with the world, an encounter with our neighbor, an encounter with God. Then go ahead and multiply that challenge by about 7.7 billion people and the ways that some of them collide and interact. It's then that we can see a few things. We see that diversity is both a promise and a peril. We see that approaches to religious studies, sociology of religion, and the practice of theology all must be grounded in an informed empathy. And we see that the only way to make progress is to accept responsibility and limits as an individual and hope and commit to the necessity of collaboration as a community. That's what Matt Crosman discusses with Casey Strine in today's episode, a continuation of our series on the future of theology. Casey is senior lecturer in ancient Near Eastern history and literature at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. He specializes in Old Testament biblical studies, but thinks deeply about the historical connective tissue that links people and societies over time and through space. Casey's also a project partner with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture's Life Worth Living initiative. Thanks for listening today, friends.
Casey, it's so great to have you here today.
Thank you. It's really good to be here.
So we're going to get to the future of theology, but let's start in the present. What's right with theology these days?
Well, that's an interesting question that I suppose depends a bit on how you understand theology. What does and doesn't count as theology? And as someone in biblical studies who focuses on the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, I'll think of that maybe differently than some other people's. But starting first from within that area, my field, I think diversity and creativity is one of the real strengths of theology today. There are so many different things happening. I mean, sometimes it's a bit hard to keep up with all the new approaches, the new theories people are using, or ways of reading, all of the ancient evidence that people are drawing on from different cultures and what have you. But the diversity, and therefore I think the creativity in theology, especially in biblical studies, is really both valuable and thought-provoking. I mean, it's hard to go if you go with an open mind to a conference, to open up a journal, to read a volume of collected essays, and not read something that's coming at a topic you're working on from a very different perspective. One that might not be a perspective you share, but will inform what you're doing in some way, can really, I think, round out our understanding of different questions and issues. And so I think that's probably one of the best things about theology today, is maybe more so than at any point in the history of biblical studies, as that section of theology goes, this real diversity, this real openness to trying new things, looking at texts and questions in new ways, and being open to what we might find, how that might enrich an approach we've taken for many, many years, or how that might open an entirely new line of inquiry that we hadn't thought of before.
That's a really kind of positive way of talking about a really diverse methodological landscape, right? There's a ton of diversity, methodological diversity all over the place. On the other hand, it can feel sometimes, especially in biblical studies, like there's a fracturing, and it can be hard to cross, even within a single discipline, these different methodological schools.
There's no doubt. It's a challenge. It's a two-sided coin. And on one side, diversity is really, really enriching and really, really helpful. And I think in a discipline that at points in its history has been known for essentially having one way of doing what it does, this is a bit of a pendulum swing in the other direction, but a very, very good one. But undoubtedly, that diversity comes with a sense of, well, those people are doing something I don't do. Do I really need to pay attention? Or how do I understand what they're doing well enough to try and engage? My current project is on the book of Genesis, about which there's just a massive amount of literature from all manner of different perspectives. And that's really, really great. But at least once a week, I think about my book project as a fool's errand. How does one try and stay aware of all of the different approaches and the different literature? How does one mind even try and interact with that, let alone grasp it and process it in any way? So yeah, I feel daunted by it personally, and I think a lot of people in the discipline will feel very much the same.
Yeah, that's one challenge facing theology. Is there anything, if we start with what's right, is there anything else you'd say is just wrong or challenges for theology these days?
Well, theology, I think, is in a position where it now has to do something very different than historically and traditionally it has done, especially in a context like I'm in, which is a state-funded secular research university, where there's a bit of a question: what are we doing there? What is our role? That question is a different question if you teach in a seminary or you teach in an institution with some sort of confessional commitment. But for an institution like the University of Sheffield, indeed for most of the institutions that we would see as our peers and our sort of colleagues in the United Kingdom, it's a really, really big question, manifested interestingly over the last few years, and a lot of discussion about what do we even call ourselves. And there's been a big debate in the United Kingdom about, do we have faculties of theology or divinity or theology and religion or theology and religious studies? And I think that conversation, what do we even call ourselves, is symptomatic of the underlying issue, which is, what are we? What are we doing? What are we providing to our students, both at undergraduate level and at graduate level? Who do we see ourselves as scholars? So the diversity not only brings with it this challenge of fracturing, but I think the diversity is also reflective of different people with very different understandings of what something that goes by the name theology and whatever else one might use to describe it, really is. And so I suppose that what I would say maybe is wrong about theology, I'm not so sure it's wrong, but it's an issue we need to address, is there's a lot of talking past one another. There's a lot of people who, if you seem to see it the way that I see it, we can talk to one another and we can do something. But if you don't see things quite the way I see it, or you call what you do something slightly different than what I do, maybe I shut you off. Maybe I just go over here and have a conversation with people who seem more in my area. They use my vocabulary. They appear to have my view on things. And that conversation feels easier and safer. And so rather than building a new, different, hopefully improved theology, we may be building a lot of little different ones that go by a similar name, but don't look like anything that is the same when you get into more detail.
So given those challenges, and given the pluralistic world we live in now, why should a student consider saying, I'm going to study theology? Why do that now?
It's an excellent question. I sometimes jokingly refer to it in the United Kingdom as the 9,000 pound question, because that's what our students pay a year as undergraduate students. Right? So the 9,000 pound question is, what am I going to get for my money if I decide to go and do theology? And there's lots of different ways to answer that question. I think the most compelling one, maybe for students, the one that has the broadest reach across people, whether they be academics, parents, potential students, policymakers, funders, et cetera, is this. Whatever your personal background is, whatever your faith commitment or lack of faith commitment is, we live in a world that is massively impacted by religion. We live in a world where over half of the people in the world, or overwhelming majority of people in the world, have a religious faith that they would say substantially informs the way that they think about their family, their political decisions, their ethical decisions, all sorts of things. Now, globalization, whatever one thinks of it, is another reality. And so if you want to be well prepared to live and work in this world, to build relationships with people from different parts of your own culture, let alone different cultures with different religious approaches, you need to understand something about that. You have to understand something about what a sacred text is. How does a religious community relate to a sacred text? What does religious practice and liturgy and sacrament or sacred space mean to a person from a religious background? If you don't, whether you believe the same thing or not, how are you going to relate to those people? How are you going to do a business deal with them? How are you going to build a relationship with them to do hard political work or anything like that? So in a globalized world where religion isn't going away, the study of theology, of understanding, when we think about that term as how people think about God, what people say about God, how that impacts what they actually do, is as important or more important than it ever has been. So at that level, I think we have a really compelling answer to the 9,000-pound question. That is, at its most basic level, one of the reasons why what we do needs to continue to be done and why students should continue to think about studying it.
I agree with all of that. That, I think, is the case that we need to be building, or at least part of the case we need to be building. But let me play devil's advocate here for a moment. Why is that not just a case for why to do religious studies or why to do sociology of religion? Is this is there any value in, it seems safer in some ways to say, well, let's just do this as a third person, what they do, what they think, what they believe. Theology, it seems to me at least, adds in at least an element of the second person or first person kind of element to it. Given all that you just said, why not just stop at religious studies? Is there value in adding that kind of first order reflection for oneself?
I think there is. And I think the question is, how do we do it? I mean, we have to recognize we live in a world, especially, again, in a state-funded secular institution like I do, we live in a place where it's not a confessional institution. It's not easy to be speaking first person, whatever one's religious background is, about what you do. But I think it's massively important. I mean, it's one thing, as the old adage goes, to read a book about how to do something, and it's another thing to be alongside someone who's doing it and learn from them. And so I'm a big believer and a very passionate advocate for the idea that we need both practitioners and critical outsiders talking about these things with our students. We need both practitioners and critical outsiders talking about these issues with every audience, whether that be in the media, whether that be within religious institutions, et cetera. If you're going to study ancient Judaism, if you're going to study ancient Christianity, if you're going to study what those things are like, you have to engage in some way with someone who's practicing those religions today and their appropriation of that to truly understand why that ancient community, why that ancient practice has any relevance. But you can't just stop there, I think. If you want to have a full understanding, it's then allowing a critical outsider to come in and say, without wanting to demean what you believe, here are some challenges to that. Here are some questions. Here are some ways in which maybe in a 21st century world that doesn't seem to work as well or doesn't seem to make sense. What would be even better, I think in many cases, is if the dialogue could then turn from that critical outsider being just a critical outsider to speaking as a practitioner themselves, whether they be a secular humanist, whether they be from a different faith standpoint, whatever it is, saying, and here's how I look at it. And that dialogue ultimately being something where in a sense, you're almost overhearing a robust discussion between two people talking about the way they view things and the way they live in the world, rather than this sort of detached, well, heaven forbid someone actually state their personal view, the norm by which they want to live their life in a public environment, to one where actually it's a robust engagement between those that people are overhearing and hearing strengths and weaknesses about from inside and outside, both to learn about it sort of in that third person view, but also then to make some decisions about what it is that they believe themselves.
So you're already encouraging us to think about dialogue and about conversation. One of the facts of the way that theology works right now, and this is a shared state with many of the humanities, is that more or less theology is a lonely vocation. We have the ideal of the kind of lone genius scholar who, right, puts together this work of genius alone. I've had faculty describe the life that one chooses as a scholar is a monkish life. This is something that has to be right about that. But you suggested that this isn't how it has to be. In fact, maybe it can't be how it is going forward. Why do you think the hope for the future of theology is in collaboration?
Right. Well, in one sense, it takes us back around to where we started, and thinking about diversity and thinking about, the good and bad sides of that coin. Diversity, strength, fragmentation, fracturing, not feeling like one can keep up with everything. It's the second point. So we know that there are strengths in specialization. We know that having someone that can do that monkish thing where they spend hour upon hour upon hour on a problem, on reading everything there is about a particular question, really making themselves, literally the world's expert on that, is beneficial. It's beneficial to scholarship. It's beneficial to our understanding of a text, an ancient culture, what have you. But the other side of that, right, is like you say, is the isolation that comes with that. Not being able to explain that to someone else, not being able to put that set of knowledge in dialogue with other things we know. We're all finite. We're all human. There's only so much we can read. There's only so many hours we can work, no matter how hard we'd like to push ourselves, no matter how much coffee we drink. And so the answer to how do you both, I think, draw out, really reap the benefits of specialization without losing the sense of putting these things in dialogue with one another, is collaboration, is working together. Now, that might take the form of like-minded people from different areas picking a question that's bigger than what any one sort of individual feels like they can do, and kind of networking their brains together in some sort of working group to try and come up with an answer that spans all of this diverse work that's being done. But it might equally be people from very different perspectives putting their positions in dialogue, either with the hope that they find common ground they didn't know they had before, or simply they understand better where they agree and they disagree, both in their own understanding of where they stand with respect to one another, but also for the understanding they might articulate to other people. We believe this, they believe that. This is what we share. This is what's different. There doesn't have to be anything necessarily wrong about that. Indeed, understanding why we disagree better, it can really be a positive thing. And so I think that for me, collaboration is both about the ability to do things one can't do on their own in a field where specialization does matter, where the amount of stuff that's getting published is just growing exponentially every year. But it can also be about understanding difference and disagreement more specifically and more accurately.
In many ways, it sounds like what you described on the teaching end is also true in the vision of research that you have. Is namely that one of the main products we're looking for is informed empathy, right? That we're learning. So it makes sense that it was need to happen, not alone in one person's mind. But there's so much in academia that militates against collaboration. Publishers aren't particularly fond of multi-authored works. It's like pulling teeth to convince them to take them up usually, because we're not the only people that kind of idolize the work of the lone genius. The book reading public, small as it might be, also has that ideal. Tenure committees don't. The currency in our field in biblical studies is the monograph. There's so much social machinery, professional policy that works. Where do you see finding getting the sort of leverage to make this sort of collaboration possible? How is this not just professional suicide for those who decide to engage in it?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know. There are a lot of institutional forces, not just within colleges and universities and seminaries, but as you suggest, within the publishing industry, within media, within sort of popular opinion, that militate against that. I mean, we do, for better or worse, often still live with this underlying notion of the great individual as the really fundamental unit of intellectual progress. And that's not to undermine the value of the individual in any way, but it is to say we are finite, limited human beings. So I think one thing to say is that there is a bit of a risk there, and there is a bit of a need to press against some established norms within universities, within publishing, within society in general. I think that's helped by a greater understanding in our contemporary world that community and working together and collaboration and teams really are important. And that's not just in a university. I mean, you ask anyone who works in any field of business, any area of teaching, and they'll talk more about, we're always being put in teams. We're being told to do things in teams. And some of that is not particularly good. A lot of that comes out to be what I kind of call cosmetic collaboration, where I'm still doing my thing and you're still doing your thing. We just happen to be doing it near one another, or
parallel play.
Exactly.
Like toddlers do.
Exactly. That's not collaboration. That's what I call cosmetic collaboration. It looks like on the surface you have a team. It looks like on the surface you have a group that's working together. And really what you do is you have individual activity side by side. But robust collaboration, I think, really is so hugely important. And there's a greater understanding of its potential benefit in society as a whole, in the way groups and communities of people are becoming so much more important in our society. And I hope that feeds its way into our academies. I think that part of what's required is for those of us who are in the academy, who'd like to do that sort of work, to be making an argument for why philosophically, epistemologically, and pragmatically there's value in that. Because if we don't have a case at all three levels, why me as a Hebrew Bible Old Testament scholar, you as a New Testament scholar, along with maybe someone who works on early church history and someone who works on medieval systematics and someone who works on 20th and 21st century systematics, need to work together to do a fully robust project, you're never going to break the power of that notion that the individual scholar is the basic fundamental unit of intellectual endeavor and progress.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured biblical scholars Casey Strine and Matt Crossman. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. New episodes drop every Saturday, sometimes midweek. If you're new to the show, welcome, friend. Hit subscribe in your favorite podcast listening app, and we'd love your feedback. Ratings and reviews in Apple Podcasts are particularly helpful, but we're just as happy to hear from you by email at faith@yale.edu. We read each comment and do our best to respond and improve the show, bringing you the people and topics that you want to hear. And if you're a regular listener, it's a huge honor that you stick with us from week to week. So I'll ask you to step up and join us. Help us share the show. Behind those 3 dots in your podcast app, there's an option to share this episode by text or email or social media. If you took a brief moment to send your favorite episode to a friend or share with the world, not only would you be supporting the show, you'd be sparking up a great conversation around stuff that matters with people that matter. Thanks for listening today, friends. We'll be back with more this coming week.